If you've ever been to the Florida Keys, you know they're full of different animals, from manatees swimming in clear water to alligators soaking up the sun. So, it's not easy to be shocked by what you might see there. But that's exactly what happened to kayak fisherman Steve. On his way back from a day out on the water, he noticed something strange floating nearby. With over 4 miles left to get back to shore, Steve decided to check it out. What he found was unbelievable. Steve was an experienced kayak fisherman living in the Florida Keys with his own social media account. He thought he had seen it all. He spent his time on YouTube sharing videos of sailing, fishing, and other water activities. After so many adventures, he didn't expect anything would surprise him. But then something unbelievable happened. He saw something in the water that he never expected to see so far from shore. On that day in 2017, Steve was just filming his usual activities for his YouTube channel. He wasn't expecting anything special. However, when he posted the video, it went viral and attracted millions of viewers. As the sun set, Steve was heading home from fishing when he noticed a strange shape floating in the water. He turned on his helmet camera to record it. When he uploaded the video to YouTube, titled Key West Kayak Fishing, he described it as a weird-shaped object in the distance. Steve knew he needed to find out exactly what it was. As Steve approached the mysterious shape in his kayak, he began to make guesses about what it was. All he could see were multiple fins running down its back, so he thought it was some sort of palm frond. While a palm frond would have been an interesting find more than 4 miles offshore, what Steve had actually found was not even close to his guess. It was much more breathtaking. The closer Steve got to the mysterious shape, he realized it wasn't a palm frond at all. He had to stop and do a double take to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. Was what he was seeing even possible this far offshore? It wasn't a palm frond. It wasn't even close. For the moment, all Steve knew was that after all these years on the water, the Florida Keys had finally shown him something new. Suddenly, and without warning, the shape began moving. It was swimming. Was Steve going crazy? After spending more than 20 years on the water, looking back at the shore and thinking about what this creature could be, the answer finally came to him. But how did this animal end up so far away from the shore? Some questions don't have answers, but Steve didn't need one. What he needed was to conduct a rescue mission. To his amazement, Steve had stumbled upon an iguana. The reptile could swim but didn't belong this far from home. Not sure what to do yet, Steve asked, "Dude, what are you doing out here? Are you lost or what?" Of course, Steve knew the iguana couldn't answer him, but he was too bewildered to care. Next, he needed to decide how to help the poor lost creature. What could he possibly do? With nothing to lose, Steve offered the iguana a lift. "I'll give you a ride back to shore." There was no way he could know if the reptile would take him up on his offer, but he had to try. To the iguana's credit, it seemed to understand that Steve wasn't a threat and began to approach the kayak. The next step was to see if the creature was just curious about the vessel or if it indeed wanted a ride. The situation may have appeared funny from the outside. Here was this small animal swimming in the open ocean approaching a motorized fishing kayak. Could it even figure out a way to get on board? For Steve, this was no laughing matter. He knew the wildlife that lived in the Keys, so he knew there was no way this iguana should have been this far from shore. This was a very serious situation. Seeing an iguana swimming so far out in the ocean would have been head-scratching to most people. Steve had his own ideas about what happened though. "I have seen plenty of iguanas swimming around the islands, but never one that far out. Most likely, because of the king tides that were occurring, it got caught in one of the swift outgoing tides and was pushed out to sea." With that knowledge, Steve knew he needed to act fast. If you don't know what a king tide is, it's what happens when major storms flood streets and the water washes back to the ocean, creating a much higher tide than usual. At the time, this iguana was washed out to sea. Florida had just been hit by a storm when the floodwaters rushed through the reptile's habitat. The current would have been too strong for it to swim against. Steve had offered the iguana a ride back to shore. Now it was up to the reptile to accept the offer or not. The fisherman hoped the animal would, because otherwise, it would stand very little chance of survival. As he wrote, most likely, the iguana would have died out there as the current that far out would have pushed it east with very little chance of coming back inshore. The iguana swam from the front of the kayak to the back, searching for a place to grab on and climb aboard. When it found a spot, it reached up but was too exhausted to successfully grip. Unable to pull itself up to safety, Steve needed to give the iguana a helping hand without scaring it off. There was no way of knowing if the animal trusted Steve or not, so any move he made had to be done with caution. Luckily for Steve, right next to him was his paddle. He reached for it and carefully positioned it in the water under the iguana. Now the reptile had a place to stand while it navigated its way onto the kayak. It was clear the animal was exhausted. Who knows how long it would have lasted floating alone in the open ocean before Steve came along. Standing on the paddle, the iguana took a moment to catch its breath. Stabilized on the paddle, the iguana pulled itself onto the support beam of Steve's kayak. As you can see, it took in its surroundings and tried to find where the land it came from was supposed to be. On the bar, the iguana looked majestic. This wasn't the end of the rescue though. Steve had successfully gotten the iguana to safety, and now he needed to get it back home. After a bit, the iguana moved to the cooler on the back of the kayak, ready for the journey home. Steve warned, "All right, get seatbelted in because we're going to go flying." Remember, Steve's kayak was motorized and he was more than 4 miles from shore. With the sun setting, he wanted to make sure he got the iguana home while it was still light out so it could find where it came from. Steve turned on his engine, unsure if it would frighten the iguana away. Thankfully, it didn't, and the two were heading back to Florida together. Every now and then, Steve would look back to make sure his new friend was okay. Not only was the iguana okay, it looked like it was genuinely enjoying the ride and watching the sunset. It must have known how lucky it was and was now taking in every moment of life it had. Somehow, against all odds, the iguana stayed with Steve all 4 miles back to shore. He was stunned and blown away. How was this even possible? Looking back, Steve recollected. It was pretty cool to see the iguana trust me enough. Sure enough, the reptile that trusted Steve more than anyone it had probably ever encountered. As they got close to shore, the iguana started looking at the mangroves. Its long journey was almost over. After traveling 4 miles back to shore, the kayak moved along the edge of the mangroves and the iguana carefully looked for a familiar place to swim to. Slowly, it made its way to the back of the kayak and prepared to jump off. When it saw the right spot, it leaped to freedom. Steve had rescued the iguana, but he wanted to make sure it was safe before he went back to shore. He turned around to check if the iguana had made it to land. He searched through the mangroves where it had jumped off the boat. Soon, Steve saw the iguana holding onto some branches tightly. After such a long day, it made sense that the iguana was clinging on for a bit more safety.